There are certain places that many people see as synonymous with Jewish life. The Lower East Side, Israel, Los Angeles. One such place is here in the South, a paved paradise on the coast of Florida. That's right, I'm talking about Boca Raton. A lot of times, my work as a Southern Jewish public historian is about following my curiosity. And recently, one question has been burning in my brain. Why are there so many Jews in Boca Raton? It's a question that begins with my grandmother, Dolly Katz, who moved to Boca from suburban Philadelphia in the late 1980s, looking for warmer weather and social connections.
I'm Dolly Katz. I am Nora's aunt. No, I am not Nora's aunt. I am Nora's grandmother. I feel like your aunt. But I am your grandmother. And I am proud to be your grandmother because you are so adorable. I love you, I love you, I love you. I was Dolly Rome. I grew up in Norristown, Pennsylvania. I went to the Norristown schools. I went to college in Philadelphia. I was married and lived in Norristown, Pennsylvania for 30 years. Then I moved to Florida. And I love it here because of the weather mostly, because I hated the cold. I really, really shivered in the cold. So it's good for me to be here, nice and warm and cozy. As far as living here, I'm enjoying. I loved the beginning of living here when I lived in Boca Point, which is in Boca Raton. It was very interesting. I played tennis every morning, played bridge every afternoon, went out to dinner with all my friends, and every evening really had a very, very good social life. Had a lot of great friends. We used to come down a lot. When we came down, I had, my husband had I think it was an aunt and an uncle. They lived further south, and we used to visit them like once every other year or so. That's how I knew what Florida was. And I knew what the area was. I knew what the weather was. So that's one of the main things that I moved here. When I first looked down here, nothing was developed after Military Trail. It was all forest. Then when I came down 10 years later, a lot of things had developed. And I looked at a whole lot of different developments here. And I chose Boca Point because it was beginning, and it really was very, very pretty. And I made a lot of good friends, really good friends. They were really had a good time there. That's why I moved here, only because of the weather and the area. So it wasn't Boca Point or Boca Raton. It was just the area that I liked. It wasn't as developed as it is now. I never saw anything like this now. I mean, you can't drive anymore. Used to be 3 or 4 cars on the road. It's different now, very different. Life in Boca is very interesting now. I mean, it's very quiet at this point in my life. It was not quiet before. It was very, very active and very, very fun. It's not the same as it used to be. But I'm older, and life is different than it was when I was younger. When I was younger, it was fun. Now it is living from day to day and existing. Not that I'm unhappy. I'm not unhappy. As long as I have my family that I can talk to and be with and communicate with. That's a very important thing in my life. My family is very, very important.
Welcome to Boca Raton, and welcome to the ISJL Virtual Vacation. I'm Nora Katz. For my whole life, I have been fascinated by this place. Its culture, its architecture, its landscape, its social and economic history, its politics. When we talk about Southern Jewish life, South Florida sometimes gets left out, and it really shouldn't. We know that the Jewish histories of South Florida and the rest of the American South are deeply intertwined, even though this part of Florida is home to more Jews than the rest of the South combined. So how do we tell the story of Boca Raton? What do we know about the Jewishness of this place? And crucially, what do we know about how it came to be this way? To help answer this question, I turned to an unlikely source, musical theater. Specifically, the 2008 Stephen Sondheim and John Weidman musical, Roadshow. Roadshow features a very fictionalized slice of this story, the story of Addison Mizner, the man who was arguably the most influential architect of early 20th century Florida. His designs shaped Palm Beach, and he was involved in an ill-fated attempt to establish Boca Raton as a resort community in the years before his death in 1933. His life is the stuff of legend, legends he actively cultivated and legends that emerged before and after his death. The musical dives deeply into the fragility and brutality of the American dream and, by extension, American capitalism, all while exploring the complicated and codependent relationship between Addison Mizner and his brother Wilson. This musical isn't about Jews. The Mizners came from an Episcopalian family. But I think the themes it explores of boom and bust, of cynicism and aspiration, of risk and failure are central to the story of this place. So we're using the musical to tell that story. Roadshow opened in its current iteration in 2008 at the Public Theater in New York City. I got the chance to speak with John Weidman, who wrote the book of the musical. John is a 3-time Tony nominee and 3-time Sondheim collaborator on Pacific Overtures, Assassins, and Roadshow. We talked about the development of the musical, the themes it explores, and the ways in which it tells this particular American story.
Steve had been interested for some time in a character named Wilson Mizner, who had been kind of a man about town in New York before Steve's time, but not by much. And he was a certain kind of New Yorker who was kind of a phrase maker, and he had about 16 different jobs. He was a drunk, maybe that's an overstatement, but he managed prize fighters. He was a playwright, at least in the sense that he collaborated with people who wrote plays. And he was to Steve, an interesting man about town. And what interested him initially in Steve's eyes was the fact that he seemed to have so many different skills and talents that he never settled on one. And so he lived a kind of a wasted life. And I'd never heard of him. Steve called me up and said, "Do you want to read a book about him?" I said, "Sure." And I read a book about Wilson and his brother Addison, who are almost always paired together when people talked about them. And I found the relationship between the two of them really interesting. And I found the lives that they lived against a backdrop of America during a particular period of time especially interesting. I did not see Wilson Mizner as a sympathetic figure who had too many talents and couldn't figure which one to focus on. To me, he seemed like a selfish, self-indulgent, wasteful person who kind of worked his way from project to project, leaving other people to clean up the messes that he made. But that's what made him interesting to me. Steve and I went to work exploring the relationship between the brothers. The way in which they would come together, separate, come back together. Addison always seemed to be operating in his brother's shadow. Wilson was the favored son, although there were several other sons. The mother's favorite son. Addison eventually separated himself from Wilson, made his way to Palm Beach, which kind of didn't exist at that point. And as soon as Addison was sort of up and running and really had made something of himself in South Florida, Wilson, whose life was falling apart, showed up and basically ruined Addison's life. And that was kind of where our story ended. The one person whose life Wilson seemed reluctant to ruin was his brothers until there was nobody else left. And then he did it to Addison. That's an oversimplification of what we wrote, but that was our take on the brothers, and that was the piece that we wrote.
The show went through many different iterations and titles from its genesis in the late 1990s until its run at the Public Theater in 2008.
Steve had an idea which seemed really appealing initially, which was that he wanted to write something. He just finished writing Passion, and he wanted to write something that was a little kind of brighter and faster and funnier. and he saw Wilson as a vehicle for that. And what he had in mind, which seemed to me to be a really good idea, was to see the brothers as kind of a Hope Crosby pair from the road movies, the Road to Casablanca, or whatever they were, Road to Singapore, I can't remember. And this would be sort of the Road to Ruin. And so he started out writing a piece in which the two of them would step outside their story and sing a series of kind of vaudeville numbers. They would agree with each other, disagree with each other. Things would get ugly, things would get repaired. So we were aiming for something that would tell the same story, but in a very different style. And it felt like it didn't work. It felt like we sort of were falling between two stools, one of which was a kind of a breezy musical comedy, and the other of which was a more serious piece about their relationship and about, what the consequences of the lives they lived were, the consequences for other people. And so gradually, I would say, through 2 or 3 iterations, we moved from that back to something that we were both quite satisfied with, which was Roadshow, which is a much more, Hope and Crosby would never have seemed like models for who the brothers were in Roadshow, but we got it to a place where, we took them and the results of their lives more seriously. And I think that's essentially what the process was.
There is a central tension at the heart of the show between darkness and levity, between optimism and cynicism. I asked John to tell me about it.
That was the tension that drove the show. And, if the show works, I think it will work. It works because that tension, as I said, is central to the dynamic of the piece. It's like is something that Steve used to as a way of deeply oversimplifying the piece. I mean, he would describe the two brothers as the tension between builders and destroyers. That Wilson's life was about kind of ultimately everything he touched got torn down. And Addison, when he finally found himself, everything he touched got literally built up. And so the tension between those two things is what drives the show. And
I want to include Stephen Sondheim's voice in this episode as much as I can, given his passing in November 2021. In his 2011 book, Look, I Made a Hat, which is something of a sacred Jewish text as far as I'm concerned, Sondheim writes about the evolution of Roadshow. John and I had been aware of this central problem from the show's beginning. Could we ask people to invest their interest equally in both brothers? And if not, which brother should it be? The visionary idealist or the visionary salesman? The inventor or the reinventor? The builder or the destroyer? Speaking of destruction and creation, let's step away from the Mizner story momentarily to talk about the places that are central to Roadshow: Palm Beach and Boca Raton. The early history of these cities is an American story of boom and bust with dramatic proportions. People have lived in South Florida for thousands of years, but the period we're talking about begins in the late 19th century, when Florida was something of a frontier for white European Americans. To learn more, I spoke with 2 staff members at the Preservation Foundation of Palm Beach, Katie Jacob, Director of Programming, and Marie Penny, Director of Archives. I also spoke to Susan Gillis, who has served as the curator of the Boca Raton Historical Society for 20 years. We'll also hear from Marcia Jo Zarevitz, founding executive director of the Jewish Museum of Florida, FIU, and author of the new book, Jews of Florida, Centuries of Stories.
Development here in Palm Beach started because of the Homestead Act. So we had pioneers coming from the north, really looking for land that they were able to farm and till that they would get for free. So the first people that came down here were really rugged. They were pioneers. They had no idea what they were going to find. And they came here after the Civil War, so really in the 1870s.
The modern city of Boca Raton really traces its roots back to the 1890s. That is in 1895, Mr. Henry Flagler, many people have heard of, decides to extend his Florida East Coast Railway from West Palm, which was the terminus at the time, all the way to Miami, as they said back in the day.
There was not even a South Florida until Henry Flagler brought his railroad down.
Flagler's idea was always to make it a place for vacation. The pioneers were here all year round. And when Flagler came, he built his first resort in 1894, the Royal Poinciana Hotel. And he actually bought the land from one of the first pioneers for $1 million. So we always joke that that's the first, land boom here in South Florida. And it kind of just went crazy from there. The development was very much increasing all the time. And people were coming down. They were only here for a month of the year. I mean, if you could imagine, they came down around New Year's and left at President's Day, because that's when the weather was good and no one wanted to be here in the summer heat or anything like that, because there was no air conditioning. Flagler set that standard for resort life here. So everybody was going to the hotels. They were at the Breakers, the Royal Poinciana Hotel. And that's why they came here. They took their train cars and they could come right here, get off and enjoy a few months in paradise.
For the next couple of decades, we are, like all South Florida towns, a little tiny farming community, farming pineapples, tomatoes, every kind of winter vegetable you can possibly imagine, and experimenting with things like rice and Suriname cherries and all kinds of things that you don't see a lot grown these days. Strawberries. So many crops, because we can grow almost all year here. But those winter vegetables were in high demand, particularly in the Northeast. And they're still grown in South Florida today, not so much in Boca.
Jews play a small part in this late 19th century story, but they don't arrive in the exclusive Palm Beach and Boca Raton communities until decades later.
The Jews moved around Florida as economic opportunities opened, as Jews did everywhere in the world, where they could live in freedom and pursue making a livelihood to support their families. And different areas changed over time. So there'd be a railroad terminus in one part of Florida, or a phosphate mine, and something would change and another area would become popular. So they pulled up stakes and they moved to Miami and they opened stores there. And when Miami was founded as a city in 1896, there were 16 businesses downtown. 12 of those were owned by Jews.
The early 20th century resort community of Palm Beach was just beginning to develop, and into the thick of it came Addison Mizner. Mizner was born in 1872 into an upper middle class family in Benicia, California. His father was the U.S. Minister to Central America, and Addison Mizner spent formative years in Guatemala. To learn more about Mizner's life, I spoke to historian and lecturer Richard Rene Sylvan. Rene's interest in Palm Beach residential architecture began during his childhood, when he would visit the grand houses of his mother's friends in Palm Beach. In retirement, he began work on a book about Villa Mizner, Addison Mizner's home. In the process, he became an expert on Mizner and his complicated and eccentric life. Mizner's architectural career began in his early 20s, when he spent 3 years as an apprentice to Willis Jefferson Polk, an architect in San Francisco.
Mizner got bored very quickly with that job, which he will always do. Mizner was a very impatient man. He wanted to constantly progress and move forward. And Polk had him working on what was popular at the day, which were the California bungalows. And so when Mizner asked if he could incorporate some different styles, Polk said no. And so Mizner left and went, this is going to sound rather incredible to your audience, but he left and he went to the gold rush in Alaska that was going on at the time. So he completely dropped his interest in architecture, went to Alaska for the Klondike Gold Rush, which was a tough way of life. So after that failed, he did that with his brother Wilson. But anyway, so they ran out of money. The project was failed, and so he left, and he said he was just going to go around the world. And so his first stop was in Hawaii, where he made do for about 6 months by making what he referred to as horrible charcoal drawings, but they were actually, if you look at them up, they're very sweet drawings. And obviously they sold enough for him to have enough money to go on to the next phase of his adventure, his great tour, which was to Australia, where he became a boxer, an amateur boxer. So his life was really very chopped up. But luckily, in the 20s, he ended up back in New York, and he studied a little bit with some of the great architects there. And so his love for architecture was rekindled.
They went to Alaska during the gold rush. As I said, Wilson came to New York, managed prize fighters, became a kind of a playwright. And Addison was always kind of trying to figure out what his life was going to be. He took separated from Wilson after they went to Alaska, traveled around the world kind of looking for himself, and found himself as an architect.
He met Paris Singer during the First World War in 1915. And it was Paris Singer who brought him to Palm Beach in 1917.
So Paris has lots of money, and he and Addison get on like a house on fire.
Paris Singer is an early example of an American character who was famous simply for being wealthy. He was the 22nd of 24 children of Isaac Singer, of the Singer Sewing Machine Company. Paris's wealth and patronage were the keys to Addison's success. But Paris doesn't appear in Roadshow. Instead, a character based on Paris is both Addison's patron and his lover. Paris Singer wasn't gay, but Addison Mizner's sexuality was an open secret in Palm Beach.
There was sort of a dichotomy. He was rather flamboyant in his mannerisms. He was rather suggestive in his language, but he would never show up with a man. So in that regard, you could say on the one hand, well, he was very closeted. He was closeted as everybody was in that period, the vast majority of gay life in that period.
Meet Hollis Bessemer, the fictional version of Paris Singer in Roadshow.
You are the best thing that ever has happened to me. You are. Okay then, one of the best things that's happened to me, you are. They say we all find love, I never bought it, I never thought it would happen to me. Who could foresee?
The sponsor that Addison needed was Paris Singer, and Paris Singer was interested, as I recall, in actually making something of the idea of Palm Beach, and Addison became his partner. There's no indication that Paris Singer was gay. I mean, we invented Hollis as a substitute of somebody who would have those kinds of resources that Addison would require, which enabled us to generate a relationship in which Addison could actually fall in love with Hollis, but actually could at the same time, and perhaps initially, see him as an opportunity, the kind of thing that Wilson would have leapt on immediately, the kind of thing Addison, who was a nice man, would not have done. But it's like, you know what? I'm going to be a little like my brother. And so the combination of those two things then, became a kind of a train wreck, which ruined the relationship and arguably ruined the rest of Addison's life. But that was an attempt to take a historical figure and make something else of him in order to build a story for Addison in South Florida.
So Addison Mizner and Paris Singer got to work.
Singer wanted to build a convalescent home. Remember, it's the First World War. Singer was an enormously wealthy man, the descendant of Isaac Singer, who was the man credited with this sewing machine. And so Mizner and he decided to buy a piece of property because Singer wanted to build a convalescent home, having already turned his 2 European mansions into convalescent homes for American World War I injured soldiers. And so they trotted on down to a marshy area here in Palm Beach, just a mile from where I live. So Singer said, let's build this building here. Well, that building turned out to be the Everglades Club, which was the first big Mizner construction here, the first big deal here in Palm Beach. They transformed their idea from going from a convalescent hospital into a club. And Mizner lived there for a little while, and Paris Singer ran that club with an iron fist. And the Everglades Club still exists today, and unfortunately is what I would call the most exclusive club in the States, but I use the word exclusive in the negative sense of the word. They still don't allow minorities, if you can believe it, in this day and age. But that's become an anachronism in Palm Beach, fortunately. But except for the Everglades Club.
The Everglades Club is beloved, and soon the wealthiest people in Palm Beach are commissioning Mizner to build their homes.
Mizner's fate is sealed. He becomes outrageously popular. He is not the only architect working in this, what we call Mediterranean revival style, but he is easily the most recognizable, most famous.
In a 7-year period, he built 39 mansions in 7 years. When you think about the supplies that were scarce, the supply chain, the term that we now use so much, when also you think about the competition of the building boom in Miami, it's amazing that he was able to get the supplies, get the workmen, and build those nearly 40 homes here in Palm Beach within 7 years.
Addison's business is booming through the 1920s when the Florida land boom takes hold.
Land boom with a double whammy, boy. Land boom, profits this thick. Land boom, down around Miami, boy. The weather's kind of climby, but it's get rich quick. Brand new communities, just take your pick. Lots of opportunities, all you need is capital. A little does the trick. Pick a steal or borrow, it'll double by tomorrow. Only get your ass to Florida and get rich quick.
The Florida land boom was like a Klondike gold rush. And people had a lot of money. It was after the war. And they wanted to invest in a get rich quick scheme. Where better to invest your money than a state that is loaded with beaches, which are quickly becoming opened up because there's a good roads movement going on. Every town is building a causeway to the beach, and the beach is now accessible to ordinary people, not just the wealthy.
And I mean, the Florida land boom is an example of a certain kind of get rich quick frenzy fed by people who either knew it was bullshit or were willing to behave as if it were in order to put money in their own pockets. And when it collapsed, people were ruined, including Addison. Wilson, on the other hand, just picked up and went to Hollywood. He did not stick around to try and fix things. Addison did.
But he decides to get into the favorite entertainment of the time, hobby of the time, real estate development. And so he and his backers, who are DuPonts and Vanderbilts and so on, buy 1,600 acres, basically southeast Boca Raton today, to create the eponymous Boca Raton development. So he did not create or invent Boca Raton, but in a way he discovered her. He put her on the map. And the Boca project, because of its wonderful publicity, became easily the most famous and the most infamous of the Florida land boom.
I think probably spurred on a little bit by Wilson, they decided that, well, let's create a whole new town. We've had our impact here in Palm Beach, a significant impact, but wouldn't it be wonderful to build a whole town and design every single building in that town? And they looked up and down the coast here, and Boca Raton, which was an unincorporated area called Boca Raton at the time, is very topologically similar to Palm Beach. And that's why they chose Boca Raton. And they started the Mizner Development Corporation in 1925. His
dream was to create the greatest resort in the world, not resort hotel, resort town. The paradise of the Western world, quite literally, a place with the beauties of an ancient Spanish or Italian town, but with American amenities like nice roadways, plenty of parking, electricity, sewage, plenty of water supply, all the good stuff that Americans take for granted. So he really did intend to build this dream city of the Western world.
The Boca Raton sequence in the musical, which is light and celebratory, but with a very dark undercurrent, captures this moment in history so well. Let's take a listen.
Wilson Mizner friends issuing you an invitation. Put your feet up, close your eyes, and join me on a VIP tour of paradise. There it is, rising up before us like the Emerald City of the legendary Oz himself, the shining Shangri-La of the New World.
Boca Raton, come down to Boca Raton, where everybody's wearing a smile, where everybody's living in style, 'cause everybody's making a pile.
Don't think twice, take our advice, get your slice of paradise.
Boca Raton, come down to Boca Raton, where you can swim and mingle and play, and invest in the USA.
Addison arrived in Palm Beach with Paris Singer, and basically built Palm Beach. What we added to that was we had given him a relationship, first really satisfying relationship he'd ever had in his life. He would have been, if he could have resisted his brother, he could have lived out his life in a very satisfying, I think, and secure and happy way. Just being in Palm Beach, taking other commissions, building another house here, another house there, respected and admired by the people for whom he was working, even if they were kind of, aristocratic nitwits. So what? He would take, trips to Europe every summer to buy stuff, to bring back, to pour into his houses. He would buy, the entire rooftops from buildings in Spain, and lots of furniture and stuff. Then he had a factory where he was manufacturing his own furniture and distressing it. He had a complete life. And then this is us manipulating things slightly, but then his brother showed up, and his brother's idea was, yeah, building things in South Florida is a really good way to get rich quick. And to us, that's what Boca was, and that is kind of what Boca was. I mean, when it collapsed. And so that the life that Addison had made for himself when he was able to separate from his brother was destroyed, because he could not help but reconnect to his brother when his brother appeared. This is not me describing Palm Beach as a great egalitarian, utopian community, but he made a place where he could be happy, satisfied, and successful. And then the totally unnecessary urge to do more, to get richer, ruined that.
You can probably see where this is going. The boom goes bust.
The bust came the very next year. The real estate bust was in 26. The banking bust followed it in 27. And then the two worst hurricanes that we've had, one of them was the worst hurricane on history, hit in 27 and 28. And then the Great Depression started in 29. So that's why Mizner's Development Corporation could not have been more ill-timed.
Unfortunately, his project started about the time the boom was going bust. Now, we know that. They didn't know that, right? Because at the time, there was one rail line into South Florida, the FEC. And by August, they embargoed building supplies. And the rail line was a principal means of getting building supplies down here. Well, you can't build without building supplies. Another factor was wealthy people come in this January, February, March. It's wonderful, it's delightful, it's delicious, it's lovely. But real people come in July and August to a state that literally rolled up the streets in the summertime. There's no place to eat. There's no place to stay. There's no air conditioning and pest control back in the day. And they go back home and say, you got to be crazy to buy land here. And then to top it off, in September 26, Southeast Florida, Miami and Fort Lauderdale had our Hurricane Katrina, okay? Horrible storm. And that literally ended the boom. The Depression started years ahead of the rest of the nation.
When the busts happened, the Mizner Development Board of Directors told Mizner that he had to fire Wilson. That Wilson, who was he was the finance director, he was the chief financial officer. And they said to him, you have to get rid of Wilson because we want to cut back. Wilson is just this bravado guy who's making all sorts of wild statements that our attorneys are telling us we're going to be liable for if this thing collapses, and fire Wilson. And Mizner wouldn't do it. So that's why they were both fired in 1927, I beg your pardon. And Mizner came back here initially as a broken man and had very, very few projects after that. And he would have died, he died intestate and poor, but he would have died in abject living circumstances of poverty had it not been for several of his very wealthy clients who kept coming over with checks for $10,000 usually, which was a lot of money in those days, a huge amount of money, to keep the bill collectors at bay so that Mizner could live out his days in Villa Mizner in peace.
So at this point, in the late 1920s and early 1930s, what does the Jewish community of South Florida look like?
There was not a Jew in Boca till 1931. And this is what surprised me more than anything, because Boca is such a vibrant Jewish community today. But because of restrictive covenants, Jews didn't go there. They weren't allowed to go there.
Those first Jews are Harry and Florence Brown, who had an outsized impact on the city's development.
Yeah, Harry and Florence were from St. Louis. I think they came to Pompano, our sister city, first. Apparently the family name was Bogoslavsky, but you know, that's what happens when you come in through Ellis, I guess. And they came down here because it was the Depression. They needed a new opportunity. And they, with their kids, opened a sundry restaurant store called Brown's that survived here for many, many decades.
They opened up a little store on Federal Highway. I think they paid $4 a month. I don't remember the exact number. Very low for a month for rent for the store. They, in an oral history, they said that that they were the Boca, the Federal Highway, which is Dixie Highway, was so unpopular, not used at all, that they used to literally set up a card table and played cards on the highway on Saturday nights. There was just no traffic at all. Boca Raton was not very populated.
And in 36, I guess, Harry passed. So Florence's in-laws come from St. Louis. That's the Hutkins, Max and Nettie Hutkins. And Max is such a wonderful part of our community history. He was known as Mr. Boca Raton.
He became very civically involved. He was president of the first congregation there. He was a founder of FAU, Florida Atlantic University. In fact, he was called Mr. Boca Raton. So he's probably the most integrated, most involved Jewish citizen I've found in the Boca area was Max Hutkin.
He owned a separate little store actually right behind where I'm sitting right now. And he was a wonderful storyteller. He gave the first speech at the first meeting of the Boca Raton Historical Society. So we're very attached to Max. He was our Santa Claus. He paid for the Christmas lights in town, but he was also one of the founding members of Temple Bethel.
At the height of the land boom, Jews actually did play a role in Palm Beach. In the early 1920s, a now little-known Jewish business opened its doors.
The Horton Inn was operated by Emil and Eva Verschleiser, and they were Austro-Hungarians, but they came from New York, and they operated a similar inn in Far Rockaway. And it's just a unique place because it's not one of these grand hotels. It was a small structure on Peruvian Avenue and County, and it still exists. It's a multi-use unit now. And it has just a unique cultural background because it was a kosher restaurant and inn. So the original name was Horton Place, and they later changed it to Horton Inn. And there's this great article from 1925 where they discuss the Hungarian food that's prepared there. And it states that the cooks were brought down from New York. However, in this article, they don't mention that the Verschleisers are Jewish. They only mention the Hungarian aspects of the cuisine and space. So I think the space is really interesting, and it opens up another conversation about the work that we do here, which is, you know, to preserve architectural history, but this ties in a bit more with our cultural history as well.
And it does. And I think a lot of these places that can mean so much to people aren't necessarily the grand buildings that we look at, because a lot of people aren't going to those, but you were going to this, you know, probably smaller place to enjoy a great meal. And it's something that people remember, and it deserves to be preserved in just the same way as a grand estate.
Part of the reason for this late development of the Palm Beach and Boca Raton Jewish communities is anti-Semitism. It's an integral part of Addison Mizner's world.
a lot of times I hear he was anti-Semitic, possibly. His development was. He personally was a very cosmopolitan person. Irving Berlin was like his best buddy. I don't think he cared about stuff like that at all, you know. But it was a time here in South Florida, I can assure you, there was a lot of anti-Semitism codified into the restricted covenants of the different developments. I've seen it on paper. I haven't seen it for Boca Raton. I always look for that because in Fort Lauderdale, which is where I used to work, oh yeah, it's just in black and white. This codified anti-Semitism. That doesn't mean it wasn't practiced here. It just not codified.
Palm Beach was a very, regressive, socially regressive society until like the 60s, really.
And that was the ethos of that time. There were Saratoga, there were other places in the country that were restricted before Florida. There were many signs that say, always a Jew, never a Jew. Most of the hotel brochures said Gentile clientele only. Never, people of your sort, people of your kind, those are the kind of expressions they used. It wasn't until 1949 that there was a state law that you couldn't have these restricted signs and the Jews not allowed signs.
When I first came down, tried to get in, I was with the Tozes. I don't know if you know who the Tozes are. We tried to get into Boca Hotel. We registered and we were told that it was full. And we knew it wasn't full. So we left. And I decided, I don't like this. Went to the corner and called and said, my name is, I forget what I called, maybe Anderson, I don't remember. And I need a room. I need 2 rooms for tonight and tomorrow night. Come, we're very available. So I knew that it was because we were Jewish. My name was Katz, his name was Toes. We were very Jewish. We were not allowed in. Now, I don't remember how long after that it changed, but it did change. And I think it's very Jewish now, very Jewish. I remember being very, very upset about it. Because why did they not want me? I'm the same as everybody else, and I wasn't any different than anybody else. Why was I different than anybody else that wasn't allowed in there? So I was upset about that. So that's one of the things that I was upset about. I don't know how often it happened, and this was very early. This was like when I was like in my 20s that it happened. So it changed after that.
This virulent anti-Semitism perpetrated by the wealthiest and most powerful people in America is happening as the Florida land boom is collapsing in on itself. And at the same time, the Mizner brothers' fraught relationship, the relationship at the heart of Roadshow, is continuing to evolve. Their closeness was intense, but in most ways they could not have been more different. Wilson, the unashamedly public lover of heiresses and celebrities, Addison, the closeted homosexual. Wilson, the addicted gambler with underworld connections, Addison, the obsessed social climber. Wilson, the irresponsible cheat and lowlife, Addison, the grandiose but moral artist. Wilson, the destroyer, Addison, the dreamer. Wilson, the leader, Addison, the follower. I found Wilson charming, but according to those who knew him, he apparently was a slimy, manipulative, irredeemable bastard. This discovery not only didn't diminish my enthusiasm, it stimulated it.
The intention from the beginning was always to write about the brothers. The larger ideas expanded from the way in which the two of them lived their lives.
Wilson was 4 years his junior, and they couldn't be more opposite. Mizner was gay, Wilson was a womanizer. Mizner was a hard worker. Wilson was a playwright of some minimal success, but he never took it really seriously. Mizner was never in any kind of legal trouble. Wilson was in constant legal trouble, in and out of jail all the time. And so the interesting thing is that Mizner had this symbiotic relationship with him where he absolutely adored him. He revered him. And no matter how much trouble Wilson got into, Mizner would bail him out. No matter how much of a negative impact it had on Addison Mizner's finances, he never seemed to regret it. Every time Mizner was a success, Wilson would drag him down and Mizner would have to bail him out. Their relationship, by the way, was loving, even though you could look at it and say that Wilson had terribly drained Mizner of all of his resources over and over and over again.
Face it, brother, we're joined at the hip, and that is our curse, and that is the miracle. You don't want me to go. Willie, admit you don't want me to go. Yes, I do, damn it. Though I'm not worth a lot, I'm what you've got, which you'll never outgrow. We were stuck from hello. It was bound to explode. Don't you see we're the same? That whatever the game, this was always our road. Stop it, Willie, enough! Come on, Addie, you love me.
The musical is fundamentally about the Mizner family, which includes Addison and Wilson's parents, who in the play are not so much fully formed people as they are echoing voices, manipulating and cajoling Wilson and Addison as their lives crash and burn. Their mother, in particular, plays a central role in the show.
Mizner revered his mother. Oh, he respected his father Lansing, but did he ever revere his mother? Loved her so much. And I guess Wilson did too, but Mizner took care of everybody, took care of the whole family, particularly his mother and Wilson.
Whether we wrote a version of their relationship with their mother or whether we kind of invented it, I can't remember. But it did seem like Wilson was always the favored son, and that's something Addison had to kind of struggle with his whole life.
Weidman and Sondheim bookend Roadshow with the voice of Papa, Wilson and Addison's father.
We created a version of their father, and Steve wrote a brilliant song for him in which he basically, on his deathbed, says, "I want you to go out and make me proud." You know, it was our generation's job to create a country. They'd hit the Pacific. Now it's your job to figure out what kind of country it's going to be. And then when Papa, long since dead, comes back at the end, he says, I was hoping you'd make history, boys. Instead, you made a mess. And I mean, that sort of bookends what the optimistic hope was for them as they touched a variety of different things throughout the story, but where they kind of wound up at the end. And you know, the land boom, the Boca story was kind of the perfect place to end that. I mean, it was the equivalent of, it preceded the stock market crash, but not by much.
Earlier, we talked about this idea of late 19th century Florida as a frontier, which is fascinating given the presence of Papa in the musical. The Mizner's parents hit the California frontier, but there wasn't much frontier left in the early 20th century, except maybe for South Florida.
There's a road straight ahead, there's a century beginning. There's a land of opportunity and more. It's in your hands now.
But South Florida didn't stay frontier for long. The population boomed in the middle of the 20th century, and with it, the Jewish population boomed too.
Again, the next huge period of boom, particularly for South Florida, is after World War II. And you can see that kind of everywhere too, because the GI Bill was so popular. So it gave the opportunity for people who were stationed here during World War II to build houses. And that's when we really get the style that people consider almost very Floridian today, like the ranch house. You know, I'm going to grandma's in South Florida, the Golden Girls, like that is the style of that time period that was incredibly popular. So we have smaller one-story structures on smaller lots.
Then the Army Air Force moves in to build the Boca Raton Army Airfield, 6,000 acres. And what was going on here? Radar training for the Air Force. So everybody in the Army Air Force who had anything to do with radar had to train at Boca, a town of 750 people. and as many as 50 to 100,000 men and women were stationed here during the war. So it was a very important place. That ends in 47. The city is able to acquire a lot of that property back and bring new industry to town with this cheap, war salvage buildings and land. And by the 60s, everything changes again because, number one, the city is able to lure the newest state university here, Florida Atlantic University, to town on the former runways of the air base. IBM moves to town to build big computers, mainframes in the late 60s. We get a hospital, we get a high school, and we also get our first Jewish congregation, by the way, Temple Bethel, because a lot of these folks, professors at FAU, students at FAU are Jewish, and they have to schlep to Fort Lauderdale to worship. So things really, really change in the 60s, and slowly but surely we get rid of all the agriculture and the community continues to grow. Over the years, I know there's a few families that were here in the 50s and 60s and so on who were Jewish. We're finding out more and more about them. But it was such a small town. By 1950, we only had like 1,000 people. So you literally, everybody knew everybody. And then of course, in the 60s, with the coming of the university, we have a lot more people here and a lot more diversity, including in diversity of faiths.
The population of Jewish tourists was growing too, spurred on by Jews' increasing class mobility, as well as clever marketing techniques.
In fact, they used to serve cheesecake from the delicatessens in New York to the people on the plane to entice them for that, New York flavor to get to Miami.
It's high time we talk about what really makes South Florida livable in the mid-20th century: air conditioning.
Before the 60s, when the condos started rising up on the beach, there was a heck of a lot less concrete. There were no tall buildings blocking the Gulf Stream breezes. And that's one reason people were attracted to Southeast Florida. It really is cooler, or was. And I found a chart from the, say, 55. And it was in a Chamber of Commerce thing. And it said that Boca Raton has fewer days, and when the temperature reaches 90 or above, it was like 6 days, than New York or Boston or Chicago. Well, I can tell you that is no longer true. And that's because we poured concrete all over everything and we built tall buildings that block the breezes. It really is warmer, hotter, but we have air conditioning. So what was endurable once upon a time is not so endurable anymore. And really, I know by the 50s, they say, affordable, what we call window shakers or wall shakers, individual units, were on the market. However, I did a little cost estimate. We have advertisements from the newspapers, and I know my own family, we didn't have AC till the late 60s because a cheap unit would say be $200. Well, that's $1,200 in today's terms. And back then, a cheap unit, that's one room. So you need one for every room. It wasn't till by the mid 60s, it looks like, when so many of our subdivisions were built and housing developments, that central air conditioning became very common as a feature. In other words, you wouldn't buy a house that didn't have that.
And that's why people want these smaller houses. They're easier to air conditioning. You can add in modern systems. So that's like half the reason why a lot of these older homes were under threat of demolition and development, because people wanted these modern amenities. They wanted garages attached. They wanted air conditioning. They wanted modern refrigeration. People didn't have servants to live in the servants' quarters anymore. They were taking care of homes themselves.
The advent of air conditioning was a double-edged sword. It meant that South Florida was more accessible to year-round middle-class residents who built and moved into the mid-century ranch homes that are typical of that period. But it also meant that many of the grand homes of Mizner's era were destroyed.
In the 50s and 60s, they started to be called white elephants. They were called white elephants because by then air conditioning was starting to come into play. So the owners of these grand homes wanted them to be air conditioned. Meisner was never really that good at grand bathrooms. And by the 50s and 60s, expensive construction for wealthy clients included grand bathrooms. And also because those homes were designed in a way which required 20 and 30 servants to operate them, full-time live-in servants. And the people who owned those homes didn't want to live that way anymore. So the result was that they couldn't sell them, nobody wanted to buy them, and they were torn down.
Retirees and snowbirds also shaped Boca Raton's Jewish development.
Post-war era, 50s, 60s on, all of a sudden people have Social Security, they can move, they don't have to stay tied to the community they grew up in to receive their retirement funds and so on. So they can have a second house in South Florida. And at the time, it was a really reasonable here, not so much now. But in the 50s and 60s, especially, all the condos sprung up like mushrooms on the beach, but inland as well, and houses built as really winter houses. We've always had snowbirds here. Since the 1880s, we've had snowbirds here, but it was this great influx.
Today, there are about, Palm Beach County has the largest Jewish population in the state, has about 238,000 Jews. Broward County, which at one time had the most, now has about 170,000. And Miami-Dade County has about 120,000.
The South Florida of the present would be unrecognizable to Addison Mizner in many ways. But part of what fascinates me about this story is that despite the short life of his Boca development project, Addison Mizner is largely responsible for the aesthetic that continues to draw people like my grandmother to Boca Raton.
But, you know, the couple of houses of his that Steve and I gained access to in Palm Beach were pretty great. He had an extraordinary sense of style.
Meisner really wanted to recreate Europe in Palm Beach, and that's the style that is most popularized with Palm Beach today, even though the original parts of it were only popular for less than 10 years, because it was really from when Meisner got here in 1918 to the Depression, or you can think of the hurricane of 1928. After that, Mediterranean revival very much fell out of favor because it was too expensive to build.
He would make furniture and he would make antiques, and he was very clever in giving the things that he made what he called the kiss of the ages. And he knew how to create antiques from new furniture. Right down to the point where he would carry a pocket knife and chains in his pocket, and he would beat up some of the pieces of furniture that were being made. He would put condensed milk on new stucco walls, and he found out that within a few months, those stucco walls started to crumble a little bit, and they looked like they were 100 years old. And so he was just so clever and such a genius.
Meisner was here 2 years. He went back to Palm Beach. Mizner Development Corporation and Boca Raton project is bankrupt. He went back to Palm Beach. He died bankrupt in 1933. He was not alone. Everybody was bankrupt. All Floridians were bankrupt because they had invested in real estate and now it wasn't worth anything. But what's fun is he's here 2 years. We name everything after him still. And Meisner Park, Meisner Boulevard, the Addison Reserve, the Meisner Center, of all the places in town named after him, he only saw one of them. And that was his headquarters building. It's called the Addison today, which still exists.
Mr. Meisner, the house you built Ava is a work of art. You must build me one exactly like it.
No.
No?
No. It has to be something for you. I see cypress arches, mosaic floors, reminiscent of the conquistadors. I see colonnades in 100 shades, with a Roman cloister to house the maids. I see.
So let's go back to Addison and Wilson. Roadshow is an American story, and it's a Florida story.
I said the theme that interested me was the kind of self-indulgent recklessness with which a guy like Wilson could live his life in an unregulated America. I mean, there were, this was the end of the 19th century up through the 20th, so we became really interested in them as American characters. They seemed to to me, to be emblematic of a certain kind of behavior in a country which seemed to have unlimited resources, so that, as I said, you could make a mess and you wouldn't have to clean up after yourself. And we've all discovered that actually, you know what? Not true.
They saw the world as a community of suckers, and John and I decided that our story would be a history of how Wilson acquired that careless, jaundiced view, and how he infected Addison with it, encouraging his architect brother to build a city, and destroyed him in the process. The symbiotic relationship between the two visionaries, one a snake oil entrepreneur, the other a creative dreamer, struck us as a peculiarly American one. This is a contemporary story, too.
You know, coming from the kind of family that the Mizner's came from, they just ran around. I don't think they spent a lot of time. I don't think Wilson spent a lot of time worrying about how his behavior affected others. And I think the country is still struggling to arrive at a place where we can not just feel responsible for each other, because I think a lot of people don't, but where we can be, if necessary, forced to behave as if we're responsible for each other. And that seems to be one of the central political tensions of the moment. And in some way, that's the idea which, is operating in Roadshow. We were writing in an odd way about a country in which there were founding documents, but there was no real social contract, that you kind of had to get into the muckrakers and the jungle and Teddy Roosevelt and the creation of, the Pure Food and Drug Act, and then, in the New Deal, the creation of Social Security. So, I mean, ideas that represented Americans' obligation to look out for each other, to take care of each other. We're writing about a period in which that really was harder to find. And I think we're now back in a period in which it's much, much harder to find. And we are going to pay a very, very, very high price for that.
Roadshow takes us to the end of the Mizner brothers' lives.
At the very end of his life, the last few months of Mizner's life, he wanted to celebrate his 60th birthday with Wilson. Mizner had used practically the last of his resources and his reserves to set Wilson up in Los Angeles. He had gotten him an apartment at the Ambassador Hotel. He had bought him a share in the Brown Derby restaurant in Beverly Hills. And Mizner had decided, I want to spend my 60th birthday with Wilson. And he drove across country, with one of his dogs and one of his birds. Mizner was a great animal lover. He loved his menagerie of animals, particularly his monkey, his spider monkey called Johnny Brown. And he drove to California in his good car had been repossessed. So he drove out in a rather primitive car on these primitive roads in the wintertime. And when he got into the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles, he collapsed and he had what probably was a heart attack. He was hospitalized. When he got out of the hospital, he and Wilson used to eat at the Brown Derby every night. Wilson had invented a one-way window so that they could see out of the Brown Derby and see who was passing by, but those people couldn't see in because the bill collectors were looking for them. And if they would see a bill collector come into the restaurant, they would both go and hide in the bathroom until the bill collector had left. And if they were served with a bill, Wilson used to say, well, you can put it on the pile over there because it does, put it on the top, put it on the bottom, it doesn't really matter. We're never going to be able to get to these bills. And so Mizner then left, hoping that he could bring Wilson back to Palm Beach with him, but Wilson didn't come. And by the time Mizner got back here, he was very, very sick. And he was pretty much bedridden for the last 6 weeks of his life here at Villa Mizner until he passed away. Wilson, by the way, died a month later. They were that linked, I think.
I think it always seemed to us as if it was important to give them an opportunity to look back on their lives after their lives had been lived, and there was no more opportunity to make them better or worse. But the fact that, the two of them wind up looking back on their lives and have to arrive at some kind of acceptable consensus meant that we could sum up what we had written, but it also meant that it was an opportunity to let them kind of find each other in a more human way, because there was nothing left for them. Wilson couldn't do anything else. Addison was dead. There was nothing else Wilson could do to him. And Wilson was dead, and there was nothing else Addison could do to try and, either get even with him or to create a life for himself that would be successful to their mother as Wilson. So it just seemed like the right place to end that story.
Roadshow is about two things: the relationship between Addison and Wilson, and the certain American attitudes and realities that shaped that relationship, for better or for worse. What the show was about at its core was these two particular people, the Mizner brothers, not the dangers of entrepreneurship, not the difference between opportunity and opportunism, not the persistence of American resilience or the conflict between artistry and promotion. Those were all ancillary themes, which put flesh on the musical's bones and were reflections of the central relationship. But the story was and is a tale of two brothers.
The one of the things that it was never built, but in the promotional materials for Boca Raton, there was a long description of a road that would lead into Boca that would be 20 lanes wide, and that would have a replica of the Grand Canal from Venice running down the middle of it, with actual Italian gondoliers and Italian gondolas and all kinds of other attributes. That was insane, a description of extraordinary excess. But the road became a metaphor which Wilson uses when he kind of loses his mind at the end. But it also seemed like, their lives had been lives lived on an endless road leading them from wherever they were to wherever they were going next. And so, again, the posthumous metaphor, you can think of it as purgatory, or it's not hell, it's not heaven. It's just like, where do guys like us go after they die? I don't think they go anywhere. I think they just keep going. But that also seemed, it also seemed to us to be a kind of a metaphor for a way in which Americans reinvent themselves. It's like, no, is anyone's story ever over? There's always the opportunity to pull yourself together, to be forgiven, to start over again.
We wanted to demonstrate the essence of Wilson's character and a certain aspect of the American spirit, the restlessness inherent in the philosophy of what's next, in the idea of reinventing oneself, so often accompanied by irresponsibility because the sheer energy of the optimism has taken over. This is what, in large part, the show is about, or at least what we intended it to be.
I know it's a long shot, but you don't suppose this could be heaven, do you?
God keeps better books than that, Willie.
Then where do you think guys like us go after they die?
I don't think they go anywhere. I think they just keep going.
Look at it! Look at it! Look at it!
Addie, look at it. You know what that is? It's the road to opportunity.
It's the road to eternity.
The greatest opportunity of all. Sooner or later, we're bound to get it right.
I don't want to let this episode go by without remembering Stephen Sondheim, whose enduring genius is on display in Roadshow. I hope that this episode encourages you to listen to the music of this lesser-known show and give it the attention it deserves.
Steve was as anybody who worked with him will tell you, was a terrific collaborator. I mean, he the sitting around and talking part was always thrilling, and despite his stature and not just the world of musical theater, but in the world, he was the perfect collaborator in the sense that, there was also completely equal give and take between his book writers and his, I can speak obviously mostly about my own experience, but Pine's a friend. I know what that collaboration was like. And this last project he's been working on with David Ives is a friend. I know what that's like, so yeah, working with Steve, one was doubly lucky. In part, one reason was because he was a genius, and the other reason was that he was just a pleasure to work with. which brought out the best in his collaborators as well.
There's one more thing I want to share with you, but first I need to thank Renee Sylvan, Katie Jacob, Marie Penny, Susan Gillis, Marcia Jo Zarevitz, Dolly Katz, and of course, John Weidman. My thanks also to Robert Versteeg, Steve Whitfield, Beth Dunlop, Phil Haas at Classic Stage Company, and John Doyle, director of the original 2008 production of Roadshow at the Public Theater. Enormous thanks to Joan Marcus for allowing us to use her incredible photographs of the 2008 Public Theater and the 2019 New York City Center Encore's productions of Roadshow. Please support the work of the incredible organizations represented in this episode, including the Jewish Museum of Florida, FIU, the Preservation Foundation of Palm Beach, and the Boca Raton Historical Society. The Preservation Foundation's Landmarks Discovered series, hosted by Katie Jacob, is a terrific introduction to Palm Beach architecture, and the Boca Raton Jewish Oral History Project, an initiative of the Boca Raton Historical Society, is a treasure trove of stories. If you'd like to learn more about Jewish life in Florida, check out the ISJL's Encyclopedia of Southern Jewish Communities, which contains concise and rich articles about every community in the South that has ever had a Jewish presence. Links to all of those things and more are in the episode description. This project was made possible by a grant from the Mississippi Humanities Council through support from the National Endowment for the Humanities. The ISJL Virtual Vacation will be taking a very brief hiatus this summer so that we have time to prepare for all of our exciting upcoming episodes. There is so much in store that we can't wait to share with you. In the meantime, please visit our website to catch up on past episodes and consider making a donation to the Institute of Southern Jewish Life to support the Virtual Vacation and our other incredible programs and resources. Before I leave you, there's one more song I want to share. It isn't from Roadshow, but I think it gets at this strange and romantic vision of Florida and Mizner's Florida that is part of what has drawn so many people to Boca Raton, past and present.
There's a song called Avalon Town, and originally this song, it was recorded in the 20s. The original song was called Boca Raton. And it was created by an orchestra leader named Grant Clark for Mizner, for his hotel and his Boca Raton Broadway. And they would play it in the Boca Raton, which is today the Boca Raton Hotel. They would play it. Well, what happened was it was never professionally recorded, as a record until the boom had gone bust. And so Mr. Clark just changed the title because it says, think of an evening in June, think of an old Spanish tune, blah, 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 you're in Boca Raton. Well, he just changed the words to say Avalon Town, which is the little town in Catalina Island, California, because it fit. Because the rest of it's about, Spanish treasure and junk like that. And that's how it's recorded. And I found a recording of that.
Think of an evening in June, under a crystal-like moon. Think of an old Spanish tune, you're in Avalon Town. Closing your eyes for a while, picture a tropical isle, studded with flowers that smile, you're in Avalon Town. Romance lingers through every hour, romance beckons with all her power to you. Think about old Captain Kidd, think of the chest that he hid, dream that you've opened the lid, you're in Avalon Town.